What would you feel if you found yourself in the operating room, with your chances of survival slipping away before your eyes? In this story, a heroic surgeon saves a patient in the final seconds, facing unimaginable obstacles. But when everything seems lost, he decides to act. Discover how this incredible moment, filled with despair and hope, became a symbol of courage and resilience. The day had started like any other for Michael Williams. At 29, he was a hard-working construction worker, someone who had never shied away from long hours or the physical demands of his job. His life was simple yet fulfilling. He spent his days working with his hands, fixing houses and building dreams. After work, he always found time for his family. A simple dinner with his wife and kids, a quick call to his parents, and some time on the couch with a good sports game was all it took to unwind. But on this day, none of that would come to pass. Michael was driving home from a long day on the construction site, feeling tired but satisfied with the progress they had made. His pickup truck hummed down the highway, the familiar road stretching ahead like it always did. The air was crisp, and the sun was beginning to set, casting a soft orange glow over the Kentucky landscape. Michael had no idea that in just moments, everything would change. As he neared an intersection, a car coming from the opposite direction swerved into his lane. He had no time to react. The two vehicles collided with a deafening crash. Metal crumpled like paper, and glass shattered into 1,000 tiny pieces. In an instant, Michael's world was thrown into chaos. The impact threw him forward. His body slammed against the steering wheel, and a sharp pain shot through his chest. The truck came to a sudden stop, the engine sputtering and then dying, leaving only the sound of distant traffic and the ringing in his ears. He was trapped, the seatbelt cinching tightly across his chest, pinning him in place. Blood began to seep through his clothes, a painful reminder of the severity of his injuries. Within moments, other drivers pulled over to help. A man rushed to his side, calling 911, while others attempted to pry open the crumpled truck door. The pain was unbearable. Michael could barely catch his breath, each inhale sending sharp jolts of agony through his chest. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he thought he might pass out. He wasn't sure if it was the pain or the fear, but he knew one thing. He was in trouble. The ambulance arrived in what seemed like an eternity, though it was probably only a few minutes. Paramedics worked quickly, cutting him out of the truck and loading him onto a stretcher. His injuries were severe: multiple broken ribs, a punctured lung, and internal bleeding. His blood pressure dropped rapidly, and it was clear to the medics that Michael was losing consciousness fast. As they rushed him to Lexington General Hospital, the staff was already preparing for his arrival. It wasn't the first time they had seen a critical trauma case, but even experienced hands could sense the weight of the situation. Michael's heart was barely beating, and his breathing was shallow, his body struggling to hold on. The ER team had no time to waste. Dr. James Hardison, the trauma surgeon on call that evening, was already in the operating room. He had seen his fair share of emergencies over the years: stabbings, shootings, car accidents. But this felt different. Michael's injuries were severe, and his chances of survival were slim. Hardison had been working at Lexington General for over 15 years and had built a reputation as one of the best trauma surgeons in the region. He knew what he was up against, but there was a part of him that wondered if even his expertise could make a difference this time. When Michael was wheeled into the operating room, Hardison took one look at him and immediately began to assess the situation. The young man's body was bruised and battered, his chest rising and falling with shallow, labored breaths. The medics had done everything they could to stabilize him, but Michael was in shock, and time was running out. Hardison could feel the pressure mounting. This was not a simple surgery. This was life and death. The team worked quickly, but Hardison couldn't help but think back to all the cases he'd handled before. He had saved countless lives, but each case left a mark. This one was different, though. There was something about the sheer intensity of the situation that made him question his own limits. As he began to operate, Hardison's hands moved with precision, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that the odds were stacked against them. The punctured lung was a major concern. The bleeding was already starting to slow, but the internal damage was more extensive than anyone could have predicted. There was a moment, just a fraction of a second, where Hardison considered stopping. He wasn't sure if Michael could make it, but there was no time for second-guessing. The decision had been made the moment Michael's stretcher entered the room. They were going to do everything they could to save him. While Hardison and his team worked tirelessly, Michael's body continued to fight against the overwhelming odds. The monitors beeped steadily, but the silence in the room was deafening. Hardison could feel the sweat on his brow, the tension in his shoulders, and the weight of the responsibility that had been thrust upon him. His reputation, his skills, everything he had worked for all came down to this moment. As the minutes passed, Hardison couldn't help but think about the family waiting for Michael outside. They had no idea how bad it was. They had no idea that the young man they loved was lying on an operating table, struggling for his life. The thought of them, of what they would face if they lost him, kept him focused. He couldn't let them down. He couldn't let Michael die. In that moment, time seemed to stretch out endlessly. Each second felt like an hour. Hardison fought to keep his composure, even as the weight of the situation pressed heavily on his chest. He had made a vow to save lives, and now it was his turn to live up to that promise. The outcome of this surgery would determine whether Michael would walk out of that hospital or become another tragic statistic. The pressure was unimaginable, but there was no turning back. The operation had begun, and the fight for Michael's life was on. Dr. James Hardison entered the operating room with a sense of urgency he had never felt before. As the door swung shut behind him, the sterile, bright lights of the room hit his eyes, and for a moment, everything seemed to blur. His heart was pounding in his chest, his mind racing with the weight of the situation. He had been through countless trauma surgeries in his career, but this one felt different. He could feel the pressure of time, of the critical state of his patient, and the knowledge that Michael Williams's life was hanging by a thread. As he approached the operating table, Hardison took a deep breath, shaking off any lingering doubt. The team was ready. His colleagues moved swiftly, and the surgical nurses prepped the instruments with mechanical precision. Hardison could see the blood-soaked bandages wrapped around Michael's chest, a reminder of just how close he was to the brink of death. Michael's face was pale, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths, each one more labored than the last. Time was running out, and Hardison had no illusions. He would need to move faster than ever before. He glanced at the monitors, watching the steady beep of Michael's heart rate. The numbers were low, dangerously low, and his blood pressure was also beginning to drop. Hardison quickly began to cut away the torn clothing and bandages around the chest, the sharp steel of the scalpel gliding over the skin. His hands moved with the practiced ease of years of experience. But even that couldn't ease the anxiety gnawing at the back of his mind. Every second felt like an eternity. As soon as he had a clear view of Michael's injuries, the first problem became painfully clear. The punctured lung was worse than he had anticipated. There was no simple way to repair it, no easy fix. The tear in the lung was deep, and as he inserted a tube to drain the air, the wound began to bleed heavily, faster than expected. The blood seemed to pour from the wound like a river, far more than he had anticipated. His team scrambled to stem the flow, but it wasn't enough. Hardison's eyes darted back and forth between the patient and the rapidly changing numbers on the monitors. The air that had leaked into the chest cavity continued to push against the damaged lung. With each breath Michael took, it seemed as though the pressure in the chest increased, threatening to collapse the lung entirely. Hardison knew that if he didn't act fast, Michael's breathing would completely stop. The situation was spiraling out of control, and there wasn't much time before Michael's body would shut down completely. "Pressure's dropping," one of the nurses murmured from across the table, her voice tense. Hardison didn't need her to tell him. He could see it for himself. The monitors flashed warnings, and Michael's heart rate was slipping, becoming erratic. The surgical team was already trying to control the bleeding, applying pressure and suction, but the blood just kept flowing. They were running out of options. The atmosphere in the room grew heavier with each passing moment. The sterile hum of the machines seemed to mock the slow, desperate seconds ticking away. Hardison's mind raced, calculating the best course of action, but nothing seemed to be enough. His usual calm demeanor was slipping. He knew what the medical textbook said about cases like this, that the chances of survival were minimal. But those were just numbers, and Hardison had never been one to rely on numbers alone. He could hear his own breath growing shallow as he tried to block out the rising panic inside him. His hands moved with speed and precision, but the reality of the situation began to press down on him like a weight. Michael's injuries were extensive, and there was no guarantee he would make it through this. Not with the severe blood loss, the damage to the lung, and the time they had already lost. Every movement seemed critical now. As Hardison worked, his mind continually ran through scenarios. What if they couldn't stop the bleeding? What if the lung couldn't be repaired? What if, in the next few minutes, Michael's heart stopped beating altogether? Each thought was worse than the last. Yet, through the uncertainty, Hardison knew that he couldn't afford to think like that. Giving in to doubt was not an option. He had to keep going, for Michael's sake, for his family's sake. As the team continued to struggle against the torrent of blood, Hardison gave a curt command for more supplies to be brought in. He had already used up most of what they had available, and his mind raced through what else could be used. A surgical sponge was pressed into the wound to try and absorb some of the bleeding, but the flow just wouldn't stop. The pressure from the trapped air in Michael's chest continued to build. Hardison's hands trembled for a brief moment, but he pushed through it, knowing that he couldn't afford any hesitation. The air around them felt thick with tension. The clock on the wall seemed to tick louder than before, and every second that passed felt like a reminder of how fragile life was. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, louder than the steady rhythm of the machines as he fought against the inevitability of death. But he couldn't afford to give in. Not now. "Come on," Hardison muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible against the backdrop of the operating room. His eyes were fixed on the monitors, his focus unbreakable. He needed a breakthrough, something to stop the bleeding, to stabilize Michael before it was too late. Every movement felt like a decision that could decide whether or not Michael would survive. The pressure continued to mount, both in the chest cavity and in the room itself. Hardison's mind swirled, but he pushed everything aside. This was not the time for doubt. He had a job to do, and he would not give up on this young man without doing everything possible. The stakes had never been higher. In that moment, it wasn't about the years of experience, the techniques, or the tools at his disposal. It was about the will to keep fighting, to push through the overwhelming odds, and to believe that there was still a chance. But as each minute passed, it became harder to believe that chance existed. The room felt like it was closing in on him, the weight of responsibility pressing harder with every second. He had faced countless challenges in his career, but this one was different. The patient on the table, the person whose life he was trying to save, was slipping away. The conflict inside Hardison grew fiercer with every passing moment. How much longer could they keep fighting against time? Would it be enough? Minutes passed, each one more excruciating than the last. The sterile, fluorescent lights of the operating room seemed to pulse with the passing seconds, each tick of the clock a reminder of how little time they had left. Dr. James Hardison stood over Michael Williams's body, his hands steady but his mind racing. The team worked furiously around him, each member focused on their task, but the signs were becoming undeniable. Michael's condition was deteriorating, and with each passing second, the odds of survival grew slimmer. The monitors continued to flash warnings, their steady beeping now tinged with an urgent frequency. Hardison's eyes darted to the display, where the numbers that tracked Michael's blood pressure began to plummet. The once stable readings were now dangerously low, a stark contrast to the panic building in the room. It was as if every machine in the operating room was screaming at them, but no one knew what to do next. The reality of the situation settled in. The patient was slipping away, and the surgeons had reached the limits of their training. The hope that had sustained them for the past few minutes was quickly fading. Hardison wiped the sweat from his brow and glanced at his colleagues. They, too, were aware of the gravity of the situation. There was no time for hesitation anymore. The room had grown tense, a feeling of helplessness creeping in. The young patient on the table, who had only hours ago been an ordinary man, now lay at death's door. It wasn't supposed to end like this. Not in his operating room, not under his watch. Then, as if some hidden force drove him to act, a flash of inspiration pierced the fog of doubt in Hardison's mind. He remembered the experimental technique he had learned just a few months earlier, a new method designed to repair severe lung damage and stop catastrophic bleeding. It had never been tested in a case this dire, but Hardison had been studying it in the back of his mind, waiting for the right moment to put it into practice. This was that moment, the one that would either save Michael or seal his fate. The technique was risky, highly unorthodox, and it went against everything Hardison had known from years of medical training. But he couldn't ignore it. He had no other options. As he looked down at Michael, his pulse quickened. There was no way they could continue on the current path. If this failed, Michael would be lost for good. There would be no coming back from this kind of mistake. But if it worked, if the technique worked, it would be the difference between life and death. Hardison took a deep breath, steeling himself for the decision that lay ahead. He turned to his team, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. He was calm, though his heart raced. "We're doing something different. I'm going to try a new approach. If this doesn't work, we'll lose him for sure," he said, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of what he was about to propose. His words were clear, each one a solemn declaration of the gamble they were about to take. There was no turning back now. His team looked at him, their faces a mixture of uncertainty and hope. They had trusted him for years, but this was something entirely new. A gamble that could either save Michael's life or leave them with nothing. Hardison knew the stakes. He wasn't just risking his patient's life, but his own career as well. If the procedure failed, he would be held accountable for the consequences. But at that moment, none of that mattered. Michael's survival was the only thing on his mind. He instructed the nurses and surgical assistants to prepare for the new method. They worked quickly, following his orders with the precision they had honed over the years. Hardison's mind was entirely focused on the task at hand. As they set up the equipment and adjusted the operating table, his thoughts raced. He had seen the data, studied the technique's potential, but never once had he used it in such a high-risk situation. This was no longer theoretical. It was real, and it was now. The room fell into a quiet hush as Hardison approached the patient again. The seconds felt like hours, the pressure mounting with every passing moment. He glanced down at Michael's still form, his chest barely rising with shallow, struggling breaths. His pulse was weak, his skin pale. The situation was bleak, but Hardison refused to give in. He had made a decision, and he would follow through with it no matter what. Hardison took another deep breath as he began the procedure, his hands moving with the same controlled precision he had used countless times before. But this time, there was an edge to his movements, a sense of urgency that was palpable in the room. He carefully began to apply the new technique, his eyes never leaving the monitors. His fingers moved deftly, but inside, he was fighting an internal battle. He knew how important this was, how critical every second now was. If it failed, they would lose Michael. It wasn't just another surgery, it was a final act of hope. As Hardison worked, the room was silent, save for the beeping of the machines. Time seemed to stretch out, each second feeling like an eternity. He knew that the technique was working, or at least he hoped it was. His mind stayed laser-focused, not allowing any thoughts of failure to creep in. If he faltered now, Michael's chances would drop to zero. He couldn't afford that. The gamble had been made, and now it was all in the hands of the method he was attempting. The room felt suffocating, the tension so thick that it could almost be felt physically. Hardison's breath came in shallow bursts, but he never slowed. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the pressure building with every second. The procedure was delicate, the stakes impossibly high, but in that moment, there was nothing else but the patient on the table. The entire world had narrowed down to this one moment, this one chance. Hardison knew that there would be no second chances, no room for error. He had to succeed, and he couldn't let anything, fear, doubt, uncertainty, stand in his way. For a moment, it seemed as though the room itself held its breath. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the monitors began to show signs of improvement. Michael's heart rate, though still dangerously low, began to stabilize. The bleeding began to slow, and Hardison couldn't help but allow himself a brief flicker of hope. It was working. Against all odds, it was working. The breakthrough had come. This new, untested procedure had given Michael a fighting chance. It wasn't over yet, but in that moment, Hardison felt a rush of relief. They weren't done, but they had passed the point of no return. The battle wasn't over, but the first step toward winning had been taken. Michael was still alive, and that was all that mattered. The operation continued with an unrelenting urgency. The sterile, bright lights of the operating room cast long shadows as time stretched on. Every minute felt like an eternity, and the clock on the wall was ticking louder with each passing second. Dr. James Hardison remained focused on the task at hand, despite the growing tension in the room. His hands were steady, but his mind was racing. He knew that every movement, every decision, had to be precise, or Michael Williams would not survive. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the machines and the hurried footsteps of the surgical team as they worked. Hardison's eyes were fixed on the monitors, his fingers moving with methodical speed. His colleagues, who had been working alongside him for years, began to show signs of anxiety. They were all well aware of the gravity of the situation, and it was clear that everyone in the operating room understood that they were walking a fine line between success and failure. The atmosphere had shifted from calm precision to a growing unease. Though Hardison had made progress with the new procedure, there was no denying that the situation was still dire. The bleeding had slowed slightly, but the internal pressure within Michael's chest remained dangerously high. The damaged lung had not yet stabilized, and the risk of it collapsing again was ever present. Hardison had spent years honing his skills, but even he couldn't help but feel the weight of this particular surgery. There were so many variables, so many things that could go wrong. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the room thickened. Hardison's colleagues continued to monitor Michael's vital signs, their eyes flicking nervously to the monitors as the numbers fluctuated. They knew that the surgery had to be finished soon. Michael's body had already endured too much, and the longer the operation went on, the slimmer his chances of survival became. One of the nurses, a seasoned veteran of the OR, leaned closer to Hardison, her voice barely above a whisper. She suggested that they speed up the process, that they couldn't afford to keep going at this pace. The words hung in the air, the implication clear. If they didn't finish soon, Michael would slip away. But Hardison didn't respond. He couldn't afford to let anyone rush him. He knew that if he was hasty now, the risks would multiply. The patient's life was on the line, and Hardison was unwilling to compromise on precision. He had made his decision to take a different route with the surgery, to try something untested, and he couldn't back down now. The clock kept ticking. Hardison's brow was slick with sweat, and his focus remained unbroken. He had faced many surgeries in his career, but this one felt different. The eyes of the entire hospital were on him, waiting for a sign, for some indication that this young man would make it through. Hardison could feel the weight of it all, pressing on his chest, but he pushed it aside. There was no room for distractions. With every step forward in the operation, the stakes grew higher. He continued to work with meticulous care, cutting away the damaged tissue, working the delicate tools with practiced hands. The air in the room was thick, the sound of the machines a constant backdrop to the mounting tension. He knew that even the smallest mistake could prove fatal. He had no choice but to proceed, methodically and carefully, trusting in his experience, but always aware of the precariousness of the situation. Despite his resolve, there was an undeniable sense of exhaustion creeping in. The hours had begun to blur together, and fatigue was starting to settle in, though Hardison fought against it. He had been in the operating room for far longer than was typical for a trauma case, and his body ached from the strain of standing and working for so long. But there was no time to rest, no time to slow down. The operation needed to be completed, and Michael needed him. There could be no missteps now. Hardison's mind raced as he navigated through the next steps of the procedure. The lung had stabilized for now, but there was still a great deal of work to be done. Hardison knew that the longer Michael's body was under the strain of the operation, the greater the risk of complications. And with each passing moment, the room seemed to grow colder, the air heavy with the knowledge that time was slipping away. As he worked, the tension in the room reached a fever pitch. Hardison's colleagues continued to monitor Michael's vitals, their eyes flicking nervously to the screens, and the murmurs of concern grew louder. Everyone in the room was on edge, aware that the clock was ticking down. They had been in this operation for what felt like an eternity, and the longer it continued, the more their nerves began to fray. But Hardison stayed focused, pushing aside the rising pressure and keeping his attention solely on Michael's life hanging in the balance. There were moments during the procedure when Hardison had to fight against doubt. Each time he applied pressure to stop the bleeding, each time he carefully worked to repair the lung, he could feel the weight of the task at hand. It would have been easy to let doubt creep in, to second-guess himself, but there was no room for that. There was no room for anything but sheer determination. Despite the setbacks, despite the delays, Hardison was determined to finish the job. His mind kept coming back to the fact that if they did this right, if they succeeded, Michael would survive. The risks were immense, but Hardison refused to entertain the idea of failure. His resolve hardened with each passing minute. The operation was far from over, but for the first time in what felt like hours, there was a flicker of hope. Michael's vital signs had stabilized, and though the situation was still critical, Hardison could see that the tide was starting to turn. It was a small victory, but it was enough to fuel the hope that maybe, just maybe, Michael would survive this ordeal. But the fight wasn't over. It would be a long road to recovery, and Hardison knew the battle was far from won. There was still much work to be done, and the weight of the responsibility he carried was immense. But for now, in this moment, there was a glimmer of hope, and that was all he needed to keep going, to keep fighting. The operation had stretched on far longer than any of them had anticipated. With each passing moment, the room became heavier with the weight of the responsibility resting on Dr. James Hardison's shoulders. His focus had never wavered, but the strain was evident in his tense muscles, the sweat that trickled down his face, and the exhaustion that tugged at the edges of his mind. Despite the progress they had made, the outcome remained uncertain. Michael's life hung in the balance, and every move Hardison made felt like it could be the one that tipped the scales, either toward salvation or certain death. But as the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, something changed. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a subtle shift. The monitors that had been flashing warnings of Michael's critical state began to show signs of improvement. The numbers, once dangerously low, began to rise. Hardison's hands stilled for a brief moment, his gaze fixed on the heart monitor. The beeping, once slow and irregular, now took on a steadier rhythm. The pressure that had been relentlessly dropping began to stabilize, gradually but unmistakably. At first, it felt like a fluke. The change was so small, so tentative, that Hardison couldn't believe it. He leaned in closer, his eyes scanning the numbers again. The blood pressure was up. Michael's heart rate was increasing. The bleeding had slowed, then stopped. It was as if the body, once so fragile and on the brink of collapse, was beginning to fight back, to reclaim its life. The room was still. The team, who had been working feverishly, paused for a moment, their breath collectively held. They, too, had seen the signs, the subtle yet undeniable change in the trajectory of Michael's condition. For a fleeting moment, Hardison dared to hope. But he knew better than to celebrate too soon. The battle wasn't over. The road to recovery would still be long and fraught with challenges. The surgery wasn't complete, and Michael was still teetering on the edge. However, Hardison couldn't ignore the spark of life returning to his patient. It was faint, but real. The air no longer rushed into the damaged lung with each breath, and the pressure in the chest cavity had normalized. The air, which had once been trapped inside, had been released. The damaged tissue was stabilizing. Hardison worked quickly to seal the lung, carefully suturing the tissue with steady hands. He was acutely aware of the delicate balance between success and failure. The whole operation had felt like a constant battle against time and the forces of nature. But now, for the first time, there was a tangible shift. The situation wasn't as dire as it had been moments ago. He continued his work with more confidence, though his body still ached from the hours of tension. The team continued to assist, their hands moving with newfound purpose. The air in the room, once thick with the heaviness of impending loss, seemed to lighten, even if only slightly. There was no rush, no frantic pace to match the urgency of earlier. The atmosphere shifted from desperation to cautious optimism as the team worked together, performing the final steps of the surgery with a sense of purpose that had been lacking before. The pressure in Michael's chest had been contained. The lung, though fragile, was beginning to function again. The bleeding had stopped, and the internal damage was being repaired. The situation was still critical, but the worst was over. Michael had made it through the immediate danger, thanks to the unyielding determination of the surgical team. As the final sutures were placed and the wound carefully sealed, Hardison stepped back and surveyed the operating table. He allowed himself a deep breath, his body slowly relaxing as he took in the results of the grueling hours of surgery. Michael's heart rate had steadied, and the vital signs that had once been on the verge of collapse were now stable. The monitors, once filled with alarming alerts, now showed consistent readings. Hardison couldn't believe his eyes. It was, without a doubt, a victory. He wiped his forehead, the weight of the ordeal still hanging in the air. He glanced at his team, who were equally exhausted but visibly relieved. The pressure in the room had eased, but there was no mistaking the significance of what had just occurred. They had pulled Michael from the brink of death. Hardison had managed to turn the tide, and in doing so, had given this young man a second chance at life. The moment was bittersweet, filled with relief and awe. Hardison knew that the road ahead would not be easy. Recovery would take time, and Michael's body would need to heal. but the fact that he had made it through the surgery against all odds was a miracle in itself. Hardison couldn't help but feel the weight of the victory, but also the exhaustion that came with it. The relief was palpable, but it was tempered by the realization that they were far from finished. The battle had been won, but the war was not yet over. As the surgical team began to close up and prepare Michael for transfer to the ICU, Hardison stood for a moment, his eyes fixed on his patient. It was hard to believe how close they had come to losing him. He had seen so many lives saved in his career, but this one felt different. This was more than just a successful surgery. It was a testament to the resilience of the human body, the power of modern medicine, and the unyielding will to survive. Michael had fought for his life, and Hardison had fought right alongside him. As the team finished their work, Hardison allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The surgery had been long, arduous, and fraught with uncertainty. But they had done it. Michael had survived. The journey was far from over, but the hope for a full recovery had become real. And in that moment, as the final stitches were tied, as Michael was stabilized and prepped for the ICU, Hardison allowed himself a small, quiet sigh of relief. They had made it through. Against all odds, they had saved Michael's life. Several days passed in the ICU, and the once chaotic, frantic hours of the surgery now seemed like a distant memory. Michael's condition had been critical, but with each day that passed, he showed signs of improvement. His vitals had stabilized, and though he was still weak and fragile, there was no denying the progress he was making. The tube that had been inserted to help him breathe was now removed, and his chest, though still sore, began to heal. The road to recovery was long, but the worst had passed. Michael remained in a haze for much of the first few days, his body exhausted from the trauma it had endured. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his body still working hard to repair the damage that had been done. But as time passed, he became more aware of his surroundings. He began to recognize the faces that came to visit him, the familiar warmth of his family offering him comfort. His wife, Sarah, and his sister, Emily, were by his side as much as possible, sitting quietly in the corner of the room, offering him words of encouragement when he was awake and keeping vigil when he was asleep. Their presence was a balm to his fractured spirit, a reminder of the life he still had waiting for him outside the hospital walls. The day came when Michael was able to open his eyes and focus on the world around him for longer than just a few moments. The pain was still sharp, a constant companion as he tried to move, but his determination never wavered. It was during one of those moments, when the fog of sedatives had finally begun to clear, that his wife and sister walked into the room, their faces filled with relief and joy. Michael's eyes met theirs, and though he was still weak, he managed to give them a tired but genuine smile. "Hey," he said, his voice hoarse but full of warmth. "I made it." Sarah rushed to his side, taking his hand gently, her eyes glistening with tears. "You're going to be okay," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. "We almost lost you." Michael nodded weakly, his face pale but with a sense of peace that had been absent in the early days after the accident. He had been so close to death, so close to not making it. The memory of the crash still haunted him, the impact, the pain, the fear of slipping away into nothing. But now, looking at his family, he realized how lucky he was, how blessed he was to be here, to still have a chance at life. After a moment of silence, Michael turned his head toward the door. He knew that Dr. Hardison had been the one to bring him back from the brink. Hardison had been the one to fight for his life when no one else could. Without him, Michael wouldn't be here. The weight of that truth settled heavily on his chest, and he managed to speak through the tightness in his throat. "Is Dr. Hardison here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded. He's been checking in on you every day. He's proud of you, Michael. He said you're strong, stronger than anyone he's ever worked with. Michael smiled, his chest aching with the effort. He was grateful, not just for the skill that Dr. Hardison had demonstrated in the operating room, but for the care he had continued to give throughout the days in recovery. Hardison hadn't just been a surgeon. He had been a lifeline. In a world filled with uncertainty, Hardison had been the steady hand, the calm presence in a storm. He had done what seemed impossible, and for that, Michael would always be grateful. A few moments later, Hardison entered the room, his face showing the same calm expression he always carried, despite the long hours he'd spent at the hospital. He had seen so many patients come and go, and he had done his job countless times. But there was something about this one, something about Michael, that made the outcome even more significant. Seeing the young man alive and talking, smiling at his family, filled Hardison with a sense of quiet satisfaction. It was moments like this that made all the hardships, all the pressure, worthwhile. Michael's eyes met Hardison's as the doctor stepped closer. There was no grand gesture, no elaborate display of thanks. Michael simply nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude as he managed a weak but sincere smile. "I thought I was gone," Michael said, his voice shaky but filled with emotion. "But you—" He paused, trying to find the right words. "You saved me. You're a hero." Hardison gave him a small, modest smile, but there was no pride in his expression, just the quiet recognition of the gravity of the situation. "I just did my job," he said simply. "You fought, Michael. You fought harder than I ever could. I just gave you the chance." Michael shook his head slightly, the words sinking in. "No, it wasn't just that. You didn't give up. Even when things got bad, when it looked like I wasn't going to make it, you didn't give up. You're a hero to me, Doctor." Hardison remained silent for a moment, his gaze steady. He had heard words like this before, but somehow they felt different coming from Michael. There was no fanfare, no desire for acknowledgement, just genuine gratitude. And in that moment, Hardison realized something. He wasn't looking for a medal or a title. He didn't want the world to know his name. But hearing those words, knowing that he had made a difference in someone's life, that was enough. As the days went on, Michael continued to recover. His strength slowly returned, and the days in the hospital became less about survival and more about healing. He had a long road ahead, but he had made it. The worst was over, and now it was time to look forward. He would walk again, he would return to his life, and he would cherish every moment. The experience had changed him, had given him a new perspective on life. He had been given a second chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. For Dr. Hardison, the journey was different. His work was done, but the lesson he learned from Michael's survival would stay with him. It wasn't just about skill. It wasn't just about doing the job. It was about the quiet moments, the gratitude that could change a life, and the reminder that every patient was more than just a name on a chart. They were people, with families, with dreams, with futures. And in that simple realization, Hardison found the true meaning of his work. Michael would never forget what Hardison had done for him. And though Hardison would return to his life, back to his patients, his own family, he would carry Michael's story with him always. It was a reminder that every life mattered, that every fight was worth it.